All right, well, joining me on the line today is a returning guest. He is a very well-known economist, professor, and author. His name is Richard Wolff. Grateful to be joined by Professor Wolff today. He is the emeritus professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and visiting professor at New School University. His latest book is entitled Understanding Marxism. I want to talk to Professor Wolff today about his new book, but before we get into that, Professor, we have seen quite an interesting 2020 election playing out before our eyes, and what an interesting horse race this has been. Earlier in the year, we began to sense, or maybe in just a couple of months ago, we began to sense that Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Socialist running on the Democratic ticket, had really kind of moved ahead. And then suddenly at the very last minute, we saw that typical Democratic National Committee kind of consolidation, and what a stunning coup they pulled on Sanders. Do you view it as a coup as well, or do you think this was just in the cards?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit of both. Let me explain. Sanders has already achieved an unbelievable and unexpected victory, no matter what happens. And let me explain what that means. Basically, since the late 1940s, so we're talking about something that's almost 70 years old, it has been and it was a complete taboo in the United States, in a way that did not exist in most other countries of the world. A taboo against socialism, communism, Marxism, any of those things. It was as if a politician who took that label committing political suicide by doing so. It was just out of the pale. You couldn't be in the slightest way sympathetic, etc., etc. And that was the rule for Republicans and Democrats alike. What Sanders has done, first in his race in 2016 and now in the current race in 2020, is basically break the taboo. That's a historic event. He has shown the American people that millions upon millions of their fellow citizens, east, west, north, and south, are perfectly comfortable with voting for a socialist. They're not put off by it. They're not terrified by it. They're not scared of it. They find it interesting, and when they compare the socialist Sanders positions and programs to those of his opponents, they vote for him. And if you look at people who are young, you'll see that he still continues to command majorities pretty much everywhere. So it is a remarkable achievement, and nothing that happens to him here on out is going to diminish that really in any way. It was necessary, as you quite rightly put it, for the Democratic National Committee, which is the old, established Clinton, Obama, all of that. It was necessary for them to basically extinguish all of the other candidates and force them, or persuade them, if you like, to fall in behind Biden, to even prevent Sanders from actually winning the nomination by the sheer victory number of his votes. And that's also testimony to the enormous strength that a socialist has been able to demonstrate. This will go on and shape American politics long after Bernie Sanders is gone. And so it has to be emphasized as historic. I do think you're right that the establishment is terrified of all of this, and so pulled out every stop. It was, for example, stunning to see Kamala Harris, who had excoriated Joe Biden during the debates, suddenly turn around and literally talk about him as if he were the greatest gift to African Americans one could imagine. It was a spectacle of the least attractive part of our politics, if ever you wanted to see it. As I say, yes, I think the Michigan results particularly are damaging for him to win by majority. But in a sense, his historic place in American political life, he's established that, and we will all be shaped in the future by what he's accomplished.
You're listening to the voice of Professor Richard Wolff. He is the author of a new book entitled Understanding Marxism. He's also an economist and a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So, Professor, as we move into 2020, we've seen this sudden spike of volatility, largely due to the coronavirus, this novel virus that's spreading around the world. And we've seen up until now, bouts of volatility in the market since the 2008 crash have been fairly manageable. The Fed has been able to step in, calm the markets. Usually it's been monetary stimulus, not fiscal stimulus, that has done the job. Now we've entered into 2020, and for the first time, we're seeing the volatility reach those 2008 levels. We're seeing the stock market really crater, a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt generated around the coronavirus. And as an economist, you've lived through these moments. You've seen the 2008 bubble, as I have, and the crash, the 2000 crash. What's your take on the coronavirus and the current state of the stock market? How do you view this in context?
Well, I'm really glad you asked the question, Jerry, because history is the best guide we have. It's not perfect. We can't extrapolate simply. But in the end, knowing what's happened in the past is the best clue we have to make sense of the present. So here we go. Capitalism as a system, from its beginnings 300 years ago in England to becoming the global system that it is today. Wherever it has become the system, we have the following story that economic history teaches us. On average, every 4 to 7 years, capitalism has downturns. Sometimes they're short and shallow, sometimes they're long, deep. But we have them on average every 4 to 7 years. It's an average, so sometimes it can happen quicker, sometimes it takes longer. The one we're in right now is unusually long. That is, the last real big downturn we had was 2008 and 9, and so here we are 10, 11 years later. That's a real outlying observation, but the law of averages is the law of averages, and so for most of us watching, we saw a capitalism, both here in the United States and global, that was, if you allow me the expression, overdue, historically speaking, for another downturn. And the history of capitalist downturns is that almost anything can set it off. We had the tulip mania back in the early days, where something in a market for flowers was powerful enough to send it off. It's never the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's why we use that phrase. It's all the other things that are encumbering that camel's poor back. For me, the coronavirus, which is a scary phenomenon, no doubt, is in the nature of this kind of event that in other circumstances, even think about the SARS epidemic a while back, Ebola, we've had the system affected by scary viruses, and we've been able to get through it, much as we've been able to get through some of the downturns since 2008. But that is the history of capitalism. It gets through some of them, but then the pressures of the basic instability of the system catch up with it, and that's what we're seeing now with the terrified, these headlines, whether it's Merkel in Germany, desperate for what's going on in that country, or here, the kind of out-of-control spectacle of our leaders in Washington that can't even decide if it's a serious issue, nor what to do about it, nor how quickly. This is chaotic. For anyone who isn't, mesmerized by public relations, it seems to me we are facing what is likely going to be a serious economic downturn, where the coronavirus is the thing that sets it off. But if you look at the collapse of oil prices, that by itself could have done the job on its own. Oil in this country now is at a price where all the fracking in the Midwest of the United States is now unprofitable. All of that fracking was paid for by money that was borrowed from all of the biggest banks in the country. That money cannot be paid back if the price of oil stays at the price it is today. That means those banks are insolvent. They're going to have to go to the government for a bailout. The American people are not happy about the bailout back in 2008. It is not going to be easy to get them to pay for yet another one. We're looking at a cascade of problems. Those are never the cause of one thing like a virus. Those are the accumulation of the kinds of imbalances that capitalism generally produces. And by the way, the best sign of it, if you like, the best symbol of the imbalance, the inequality in the United States. And to have Jeffrey Bezos to spend $125 billion when the Federal Reserve survey indicates that more than half American families could not meet an unexpected expense of $1,000 because that's an economic system waiting for a crisis, no matter what sets it off.
And that's exactly what you wrote about in your book, Understanding Marxism, which, again, I had a chance to read last week. We were talking about off the air, and I was really impressed with the way you laid out Marx for the average American reader, which I assume was your intended audience, but just the average layman who doesn't really understand capitalism, let alone Marxism itself, or even Karl Marx. And as I was reading through the book, one of the things you said actually early on page 3, which I found very interesting, and I think maybe you could elaborate on this. You called Marxism the critical shadow of capitalism. I think that sentence really is pregnant with a lot of understanding in it. Can you explain what you mean by Marxism being the critical shadow of capitalism, as opposed to being some monolithic structure of its own?
Right. You know, the way to preface it is to say Marxism has been used and it has been abused. And you can't judge it only by the abuse. Every great series of ideas, mathematics, Christianity, you name it, has its users whom we celebrate and its abusers whom we criticize. Marxism is no different. Here's what I meant. Capitalism, like the systems that preceded it, slavery, feudalism, tribal economics, small self-employed farmer economics, you name it. Every one of those systems had the people who celebrated and loved it and the people who were critical of it. And they debated and they argued. And in the end, those systems were passed. That is, they were superseded. We put aside slavery after centuries of experiments with it and debates over it. We did the same with feudalism. There is no reason to be afraid of or to be worried if capitalism displays the same debate between those who love it and those who criticize it. That's how systems identify their problems. That's how systems improve. We're proud in America that we criticize our education system and our road system and all the rest. We criticize our economic system. Otherwise, it rots from the abuse of pretending that there is no criticism. And all Marxism is the most developed, sophisticated accumulation of criticisms that we have. To study Marxism, which I've done, is not necessarily to become anti-capitalist. You may not, but you will learn the way you always learn from criticism. Let me give you a simple example to end this. If you knew about a family up the street, and you knew that they had a mama and a papa and 2 kids, and you wanted to understand that family, would you go up and talk to only one kid, the one who loves the family, but not talk to the other kid, the one who has criticism? I think most rational people would say, no, you to both of them, and then you draw whatever conclusions you think are reasonable from the 2 perspectives. We have in America loads of people who love capitalism, and that's fine. But we also have lots of people who are critical, and Marxism is the most developed literature of criticism we have, both of experiments to go beyond it, but also of criticisms of people who live in capitalism. It is the product of capitalism. I laugh sometimes when people say, well, capitalism won and social Marxism lost. That's a mistake, because if capitalism won, nothing more guarantees the future of Marxism, the critique of that capitalism, than the persistence of the system itself, because it is the shadow, it is the child, if you like, of capitalism. And I think we would be a healthier and better off society, capitalist for a while, if we understood and took seriously the criticisms of Marxism, rather than pretending we don't need to think about them or understand them or see them.
That's such a great point. And it seems like things like capitalism almost become deified, and they become untouchable in the fact that you cannot criticize. And Marx does the unthinkable. He criticizes the deified idea or concept or construct of capitalism, but he was not a critic of democracy. He was not a critic of many of the other fraternity and equality. He was very much, from what I read in your book, he felt betrayed by capitalism because he felt like it didn't produce what it promised. It didn't really spread the wealth as he had perhaps believed that it might.
He was a child of the French Revolution and the American Revolution. He loved those things. He thought that democracy, equality, liberty, fraternity, the slogans of the French and American revolutions were exactly what the world needed. And he was like everybody else of his generation, caught up in those momentous changes at the end of the 18th century. For him, capitalism promised, when it displaced feudalism, when we no longer had the lord and the serf, but we replaced that with the employer and the employee, the typical arrangement in capitalism, that would bring, which what those revolutionaries from Thomas Jefferson to Robespierre had promised, that would bring a new world, that capitalism would bring liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. And when it didn't happen in the middle of the 19th century, when Marx became an adult that could look around, when it didn't happen, he drew the conclusion that capitalism had promised to bring those wonderful things, but had failed to deliver on that promise. And his criticism of capitalism begins at that point. That's its objective. How do we get the liberty, equality, democracy promised by the advocates of capitalism, but that they failed to deliver? And his interest in going beyond capitalism was to get to a place to set up an economic system that had a better chance of realizing liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy than capitalism had shown itself able to do. And today in America, looking at the levels of inequality we have, you kind of have to take your hat off that Mr. Marx had something to contribute.
I was reading a book recently, Professor. It was entitled The Unintended Reformation. It's an older book, and it talks about how religious revolution or the Reformation led to a secularization of society. And whenever I think about Karl Marx, I kind of see him in some way in a similar vein to Martin Luther. Martin Luther launched an unintended reformation. I'm convinced if Martin Luther could see the current fractured state of Protestantism, he would disown much of it. In fact, if you walk into a Lutheran church, it feels and looks very similar to a Roman Catholic church and a mass. But the disciples of Luther and of Calvin, for that matter, often took the thoughts and ideas and writings of these reformers and they extended them, oftentimes in ways that were unintended by Luther or by Calvin. And so I see the plight of Karl Marx, and maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe you can help me, but I see the plight of Karl Marx in a similar vein, that perhaps much of what has perpetuated in his name may not represent what his goal was. And as a longtime student of Karl Marx, would you say that his writings should be blamed for all of the horrors of the authoritarian communistic regimes that arose up in his name, or is this maybe a case of unintended consequences?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a case of unintended consequences. I think you see that everywhere. I think that many of the great thinkers of the history of the human race would be aghast at what some people, not all, have made of their writings. You know, there's a famous story of Karl Marx, who in his lifetime went to a meeting late in his life when his writings were known, and listened to a young Marxist explain, and at the end of the meeting he turned to the young man and said, "If that's Marxism, I'm no Marxist." That's how distressed he was, even in his own lifetime, with what some people did. I mean, yes, I think that in the Soviet Union and in other parts of the world, politicians used the notion of a revolution against capitalism, of doing something that was less unequal, doing something that was less unstable, doing something that was more beneficial to the mass of working people, was a clever device. It was something to say you believed, even if your objectives were actually quite different, in just the way that dictators around the world today, from Saudi Arabia to Brazil, refer to themselves as quote-unquote Democrats. When we look at what they do, they're the furthest thing from it. But there's no place that gives out a certificate allowing you to use a word. You wake up one morning, call yourself a Democrat, doesn't mean you are one. Just the same, you wake up one morning, call yourself a Marxist, doesn't mean you are one. There are always different interpretations, and I think it's necessary to be critical of those interpretations of Marxism that you don't like. There are plenty of those that I don't like, but there are others that I find deeply insightful, and you wouldn't want to throw out the benefits of looking at what makes sense because you are critical of other interpretations, and that's exactly why your metaphor of Christianity or Catholicism or Lutheranism they have exactly the same problems, and they should be aware that that logic that it requires you to distinguish among the interpretations of a body of thought, that has to extend to socialism, communism, Marxism, on the same grounds.
People seem to be terrified, literally terrified, by the idea of Marx's criticisms augmenting capitalism, or in some way changing the current setup. And we see that especially how the GOP was preparing, and maybe still are going to run, with this capitalism versus socialism debate, which is really quite fraudulent because, as you've pointed out, and as many others have pointed out, if you drive on a highway, or if you go to a public park, or if you take a Social Security check, or if you accept a bailout from your federal government, in many ways, you're participating in a Marxist world, right? And so it's strange how they have created this dichotomy of capitalism on the one hand, or socialism on the other, and there's no way the two can touch. There's no way that the two, but in reality, we have a mixed economy here. So there's really quite a bit of misunderstanding, and I think your book perhaps can really help people along those lines. Do you find the recent bailouts being bantered about by the White House just kind of comical, considering they're so strongly against socialism?
Absolutely. I find it hypocritical in the extreme. Every time, and you saw it really dramatically in 2008 and 9, when the private capitalist sector hit a bump, had a real problem, the very people who had been giving a speech the week earlier about how the government is a mess up and the government is a burden on the backs of big businesses, they all got in their private jets, flew to Washington, got down on their knees, and begged the government to save them, which it did. Everything from General Motors to all the big banks in New York, there they were, groveling before the very earlier said was an economic mess. Now it became suddenly the economic savior. But I think that the demonization of Marxism and socialism has a simple explanation. It's the fear of the private enterprise systems leaders that they won't be the leaders in some future, that their own system has so alienated the mass of people that they are, as Americans now are, in millions, voting for a socialist. The handwriting is a little bit on the wall, and that's what happened in the 1930s, and that's why at the end of World War II, there was this massive attack on everything socialist and leftist, because they were horrified that during the Great Depression, the government created Social Security and unemployment compensation and a minimum wage, and all those things that helped the mass of people that private capitalism had not achieved in the prior century, and to demonize socialism was the answer. And I'm, for one, very appreciative that the demonization is now over, and that's why Bernie is an important historical figure in American history, because his initiative, following on the Occupy Wall Street movement, really broke that taboo that we began this conversation with.
Very interesting stuff. We've been listening to the voice of Professor Richard Wolff. He is the author of a new book called Understanding Marxism. He's been labeled by the New York Times as probably America's most prominent Marxist economist. So therefore, this makes it a very obvious book for you to write, Professor. I really appreciate you taking time to join us on Follow the Money Radio. And in our final moments, I know your own work has really focused a lot on taking the concept of socialism in this direction of democracy at work. And I find that concept to be so interesting as we bring this to a close, because that promise of democracy that was written into the founding documents never quite made it to the workplace. So we have self-rule at the government level. We're the little kings, and we get to vote for whoever we think is good. But when it comes to work, we're still the serfs, aren't we? We're still the employees. We didn't get democracy in the workplace. And that is quite a stunning contradiction. It's very, very odd.
Yes, and that's been the thrust of my work and continues to be the thrust of my work. When I say socialism, I don't mean a big government. I'm not interested in big government any more than most other Americans are. That's not my goal. For me, the government is at best a mechanism, a tool, a way we get things done for society. But I'd much prefer having groups of people be self-reliant in a way that's democratic, but that allows real decision-making to be done by the people. And I've always found it this contradiction, as you rightly put it, that we want to vote for the person who sits in City Hall or the person who sits in the state legislature so that we have some control over them because we recognize how they have power over us. But then when we go to work, 9 to 5, 5 out of 7 days of the week, to an office or a store, and we allow a tiny group of people, the owner, the board of directors, or whoever it is, to make all the decisions. We have no power at all. They can literally tell us not to come back Monday morning when it's 4 o'clock on Friday, and we slink away. We have little or no control. We don't have any democracy whatsoever. We have kingdoms. We abolished the king in political society, but we reestablished the same king in the little business or the big business and around which we organize our lives. So for me, the socialism of the 21st century is going to be the movement, which I see growing all over the world, to change the way we organize the workplace. So it becomes literally democratic. If democracy is what we claim we believe in, and I take that very seriously, that it ought to be at the workplace in the society we're trying to create.
Very, very interesting. And you have written quite extensively on that topic and have spoken and even written another book on that topic. If people want to learn more about you and your work, Professor, how can they do so?
Very simple. The best way is to go to a website called Democracy at Work. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. But you can also go to YouTube, again looking up Democracy at Work, and you can see the whole range of radio and television programs, books and articles, media interviews. There's more stuff on there to give you information than you probably will have the patience to go through, but we put it up there in the hope that you'll find it interesting and another way to look at the society we're trying to survive in.
Really appreciate your perspective, not afraid to touch the deified construct of capitalism, but actually to perhaps improve it, perhaps to even make it better for all people. It's a very, very interesting topic.
The goal. And let me also take a moment to thank you for having the courage, mindedness to deal with these questions and to invite folks like me so that other perspectives can get an airing and become part of the national conversation. That's the way to make a healthy society better.
It's our honor. Thank you, Professor, for being here. Again, if you want to reach out to Professor Wolff, go to democracyatwork.info or search his name on YouTube and find many videos of him speaking on these same topics. Thanks again, Professor. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, and the best of the day to you.